My name is Mila Lazarova, and I'm a professor here at Beedie, and I'm delighted to be joining you this morning. This is only my second event in 2 years, and I still find these very, very exciting. After so many months on Zoom, it's so lovely to see people, and I found a piece of clothing that fit this morning, which was fantastic. So that made my day. But far more importantly was I was considering the kind offer to moderate this. Today is a Sunday. It's also Mother's Day, even though I think that's a bit of a silly holiday because every day should be Mother's Day. I still decided to talk to my family and say, should I do this? There's this panel, and I have a 13-year-old son. I've only managed one kid, which, by the way, is environmentally sustainable. And he's did one of those things that, 13-year-olds do. When he knew who was involved in the topic, he said, "Mom, of course you should do it." So here I am today, very glad to be in this group of people and to welcome our esteemed presenters. Unfortunately, all of them are joining us through Zoom. And this is going to be rather awkward. I have empty chairs and people scattered all over the world, but we'll make it work. So you'll see some awkward movement on my side. Do not let that deter you to enjoy the conversation. With that, I propose that we begin. Do we have all of our presenters? Because I can't actually see anything. Everybody's online? Okay, excellent. So today we're joined by Kolk, who's a professor at the University of Amsterdam, Jorge Rivera, who's a professor of strategic management and public policy and Tucker Endowed Fellow at the George Washington University School of Business, and Jason Miklian, who's a senior researcher in business, peace building, sustainable development at the Center for Development and Environment at the University of Oslo in Norway. We've designed this in a way that in our first question, we will ask them to speak about themselves, and that will take care of a sort of a better presentation of their work and their careers. Kolk, of course, is a name that you would recognize, having thought about this for probably longest of all of us, these topics that we're discussing today. Obviously, all of them are very well published. I need not waste your time giving you all of their accomplishments. They're, of course, actively engaged in the conversation, in the scholarly conversation. All I wanted to mention is that Jorge has a book, Business Adaptation to Climate Change, that's about to come out. And Jason Miklian's book, The Vortex, was just recently nominated to be a book of the month by the Wall Street Journal. So you will see more of that. And with that, I would like to begin with my first question. And I don't see my presenter, so eye contact is impossible, but let's imagine have eye contact? Okay. So, Ans, you obviously have given issues of climate change in business a lot of thought. Can you talk about how and why you started doing research in that area and how your thinking has evolved over the years?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I attended some of the sessions virtually yesterday. They were very interesting. Having a multidisciplinary background, I combining business with international relations and political science. I was attracted as a student already by international environmental politics, and I started my interest in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was adopted in 1992 at the Rio Conference. In the summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. And actually looking back at that convention, you already see a lot of the things that are still very relevant today. So there was an emphasis on the drastic reduction of emissions. There was actually attention for countries, ecosystems to adjust and to adapt in a way that, well, we talk a lot more about today. So the whole issue about mitigation and adaptation, although mitigation has received most attention and adaptation has come more recently, as Jorge will say a lot about, it was already present at the Rio summit in 1992. And actually it went back already to, we hear a lot nowadays about Stockholm 50 plus, that it was already present there. So as a young student, I got really interested in these types of things. And especially because of the fact that this summit, if you go back to this convention, it already talked about common and differentiated responsibilities of countries, the respective capabilities of countries, the different social and economic conditions, that we should take into account the fact that these countries are different, that they may have different standards, spillover effects of measures onto climate change. And so all these kind of things were already present at the time. And the only thing I thought at the time is why, of course, having a very international business focus, why haven't we looked at this from the field of international business? And also, why are other people not looking at this from the field of international business? So that is actually where my interest started. Companies already lobbied at the time. So the World Business Council for Sustainable Development was created. They came with some, what we now would now call greenwashing, some good examples of how they were addressing climate change. But for the overwhelming majority, companies were lobbying against measures, lobbying against policies, and some were even contesting the science of climate change. And I actually followed it as it unfolded over the years up to the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And it was a real fascinating, I followed it real life, and it was fascinating. But interestingly, we didn't pay a lot of attention to this in the field of international business or business more generally, but also, on the policy side, there wasn't a lot of attention for the role of companies. So also, for example, I'm based in the Netherlands, where, of course, we've been adapting to climate change for a long time. And with a huge climate science and environmental studies community, but even there, they weren't really paying attention to companies. Well, as companies as actors in a general sense, but not the specifics of companies. And so there was an essay prize in the mid-1990s, and I submitted something like, that they should consider the role of multinationals and they should consider the role of business when designing climate policies and when coming up with climate policies. And I won an award for that. But I find it still very interesting that these communities are relatively separate. And over the years, of course, it has become much richer than this. I've published quite a lot of things on these types of topics. The technologies have evolved, but it is really a topic which I would say is so where international business is so important, because there are different pathways. Countries follow different pathways. There are different locational factors. Issues. There are many issue-specific factors. There are differences within sectors, between companies, between locations. There are multi-level policies, and so this is really a complex problem. And I've always been. It's great that there's much more attention now. But I've been fascinated by this phenomenon a lot, and of course now we're not talking only about climate change anymore, but also about the energy transition, which is perhaps for some less politicized in nature than the issue of climate change, and we see a lot of differentiation between the types of companies. So the ones that are fossil fuel emitters. We have traditional fossil fuel companies. We have new big tech companies. We have small digital ventures, and they all play a different role in regard to either contributing to climate change and are probably helping to solve climate change. And to what extent these multinational firms are impacted or can contribute to the energy transition or to helping address climate change really depends on the specific activities they undertake, the business models they have, the energy base of their business models, and their locational peculiarities, all the way from, say, local policies to regional, subnational policies, national policies, regional policies like in the EU, and supranational policies. So I think there is still a lot to be researched. Let me stop here for that.
Thank you, Hans, very much. May I direct the same question to Jorge Rivera now? If you could tell us a bit about your interest in the topic and how it has evolved over time.
Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. Very excited to talk to you. I wish I was in Seattle. I think my path is a little similar to Hans. I started to get interested in these topics in '92, but I didn't do research directly related to climate change until probably the early 2000s, where this issue seemed not to get tracked. Now, it's always on the news, but it doesn't seem to get tracked in the business community. So to me, the motivation was related to an article I read in a bibliometric journal in 2008. This is a discipline that I'm not familiar with, but in bibliometric studies, they track journals in different disciplines. So there's a study that came out in 2012 that tracked the top 23 business academic journals and how much they published. So between 2005 and 2012, there were about 23,000 articles published in the top 23 business academic journals, and GSEM is one of the journals included in this list. So out of 23,000 journals, only 32 out of 23,000 articles published in this journal mention the word climate change, greenhouse gas, global warming in their title, their abstract, their keywords, or introduction. So that's about 0.01% of all the articles published. So to me, that was quite shocking, dismaying. Of course, as we know, there is a strong resistance in the business community to deal with this issue, particularly early on. And the business school professors are a reflection of that community. We are part of the community, although sometimes we don't think so, but we actually are an integral part of them. We train all their managers. So even if, to be fair to the literature in these top journals, even the number of articles was 10 times more, no? Because maybe there is topics that don't mention these terms, but that might directly have a relationship with it. We still will have like 1% of the journal, of the 23,000 articles published in this journal that don't cover this topic. So to me, that was quite interesting. And I've been doing research in other areas, green certification, and I decided, I've been doing this for 15 years. I had to make an effort to try to tackle this issue. How companies respond, how they adapt, are they mitigating, or is just talk? And then, of course, there is the large group of companies that are not only not doing any of this, just actively lobbying against doing anything to deal with this problem. These companies are smaller, the number of these companies are smaller now, but they're still out there. So that's how I got interested in this, based on the complete lack of attention. Now, we are very good to talk about grand challenges, and every time you go to a conference, you hear this term, no? But we don't publish much in this area.
Would you venture a guess if the same bibliometric study was conducted today, 10 years on? Would you venture a guess whether anything would have changed?
Actually, I'm working on this now with my doctoral students. We are writing a review of the literature for a journal called Organization and the Environment. Then between 2012 and 2022, there is about 300 articles out of about 42,000 articles that are published in this top elite journal. In some disciplines, the number of articles in the initial period from 2005 to 2012 is 0. In finance and marketing, 0. So it's quite something. Everybody's talking about it, but we talk about it, but we don't publish it.
Well, some optimism. They've grown a little, but not nearly enough.
I'm optimistic. That's why I got into this. I said, if we're not publishing, this is an opportunity. And we had to learn about this. This is an area nobody's exploring. So I'm optimistic in the sense that, well, we could do things about it, but so far we are ignoring it, no? And it's a missed opportunity.
Thank you so much. Same question to Jason, please.
Great, and thanks so much for having me. Just like Jorge and Hans, I wish I could be there in person, but hopefully this will be almost as good. Like Hans, I actually come from the international relations, political science side of things. I've been a peace and conflict researcher for about 15 years now. And my work actually combines a couple of different strands that often aren't connected. And the first is the role of business in crisis more generally. And the second is the climate conflict relationship in particular. As Jorge was talking about, most of us recognize that over the next decade, there is going to be tremendous challenges that come up from climate change that go far beyond the need for adaptation or mitigation. When you combine it with political conflict or inequality, it can produce unprecedented global security. But there is, as Jorge mentioned, actually, there is just this massive research gap. So we've been looking at this for the last decade or so, and we found that some companies have actually perfected ways to manage this uncertainty that constant crisis can bring, and they do so in some of the most volatile places on Earth, which are conflict zones. So the way in which those businesses were able to succeed in some of these hard places was really fascinating to me. So myself and many other scholars on various teams I work on have spent about a decade now researching businesses working through these areas to try to learn what works under crisis and why in a broad range of different political and social settings. So I'll come back to that a little bit hopefully later on, but I also want to talk a little bit more extensively about the climate conflict relationship, because that might be something that is a little bit newer to this audience in particular. Because we hear a lot about this in the media about, what is climate change going to do to our, global society? Very often people bring up the old Department of Defense comment that this is a threat multiplier, that climate change will make effectively everything worse, everything more difficult, and everything more unpredictable. But it's also a situation in which media attention is given to those people who sound the alarm on the climate conflict links. There's almost a focus on the disasterization of it all. Like if you think about the recent movie, Don't Look Up, it's all about trying to scare people into action, which is absolutely terrifying. But the question then becomes, is this actually the most effective way to get individuals, to get companies, to get governments to actually change? So the body of research that's come out on the climate conflict relationship tends to show that, any big event like a megastorm, cyclone, typhoon, etc., if it smashes up against pre-existing societal tensions, it can absolutely lead to conflict. So climate change is a threat multiplier, but so are other societal aspects like economic shocks, ethnic exclusion, horizontal inequalities, or resource depletion. It all ties together as pieces of a whole, this combination of overlapping risks that companies have to first assess and then try to work through. But it's going to happen more and more places in the world, and that's something that everyone needs to understand, because one recent study actually showed that almost 1/3 of the conflicts that have come up over the past 40 years in these sorts of places were actually preceded by a climate disaster within 7 days. So for that reason, this is really one of the most undercalculated geopolitical risks for companies today. But what's the right way to talk about this? I mean, is it really the best way to try to scare people into action? We have the lives and livelihoods of millions of people at stake. Or should we instead try to tell it through a story of hope? And that's what my recent book with the journalist Scott Carney does. It's called The Vortex, which is the true story of how the deadliest storm in human history triggered a genocide, a civil war, and actually brought the world to the brink of nuclear Armageddon. Now, this is actually a story of hope because it's about the resilience of people who came together after a climate disaster to achieve the impossible, which in this case was beating back a genocidal ruler, taking on Richard Nixon and the United States government, and against all odds, they actually created the new country of Bangladesh. And the point of the book is really not to just show this unbelievable story of what had happened, which has kind of been forgotten by history, but also to show how the connections between disasters and climate disasters, especially in conflict, can have consequences that affect everyone, even if the disasters happen in faraway places. So it's a bit of a cliche, of course, to say that everything's connected. But when you look at it from a geopolitical perspective, it's worse than that, because everything can be a multiplier. And even peace research scholars don't know which local conflict or which type of local conflict is going to morph into one that leaders in other countries halfway across the world are willing to risk everything over. So how does a business try to work through this impossibly challenging environment? Because this climate conflict connection is one that's, I would say, the biggest, most complicated, and fastest growing geostrategic risk that companies face today.
Okay, I'm a little scared, even though you said that's probably not the best way to tackle that, but you've already touched upon that a little bit in your answers, but let's bring the conversation from your past and current work to the very present. So the most recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change suggested that things are not going as well as we want them to, and if they were to go better, we need to act with some urgency. Thinking about the report, what is your level of optimism? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about how we're handling this? And there's two pieces to that. One is how we're handling it as researchers. As Jorge was saying, we talk about it, but we don't actually research that. And how do you think about it in terms of multinational companies or companies? How are they handling it, right? So I just committed a mistake. Moderator should only ask one question at a time. So let me try this again. Think of the report, optimistic or pessimistic in terms of research and business. Hans, may I have your question? May I have your answer first, please?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I share Jorge's view that that there's not that we have not published a lot. At the same time, I would say it's about quality and not about quantity. And indeed, it was very difficult to get your pieces into. So I published for 5-6 years on business and climate change before it got into international business journals. But still, it is good that there's now quite some attention to this. And I think there are so many topics that we can further research, and where, as international business scholars, we can really make a contribution, given that we understand how global business, how firms, small and large firms, can make a contribution. And I do share Jason's view that we should also think about sort of like the more optimistic, perhaps, perspective, in the sense that it is not only bad. So in the peace and conflicts literature, we moved from conflict to how can companies contribute to peace. And I think this is also an area where we should think okay, what sort of contribution can IB scholars make to doing these types of things? And what we can do in particular is shedding light on the complexity of companies across different locations, the different types of companies that we have, and how they can make a contribution. And of course, we have been moving from, now that there's more action on climate change, even though a lot of companies are still talking more than they are acting, I think we are now in the situation that we can help to shed light shed more light on what they're actually doing in these different type of locations. So I think international business scholars can really make a contribution by explaining what companies can do in their different sectors, with their different business models, in the different locations in which they're operating, and especially the interaction between companies, the technologies that they have. And I think, students are also asking this, right? As your son said to you, Mila, you should go there, of course, hearing the topic. I think that's what our students are also asking from us. And I don't think the urgency, people are perceiving the urgency now perhaps more than they did, in 1992, but then it was also already a very urgent issue. And I think, and I think what we should particularly do is go into, not talking about grand societal challenges in general, or or the SDGs as a whole. I think we should really go deep into the specific relations. I mean, like Jason said, with regard to conflict and climate, but you have a food, water, energy nexus. You have all these interactions between these different types of issues, and I think it's very important. Also, yesterday you had the CEO of Ballard. I think even the individual technologies are already very complex in and of themselves, and I think where we can make a contribution, I think we should do that. Also, to help our colleagues in other disciplines who talk about policies, who talks about complexities on interdependent systems and transitions and all that. And I think where we can make a specific contribution is we know about companies which are key actors in this area. And there's so much research to do. So rather than just being, negative about we haven't done it and there's not a lot of people, I think we should encourage all our students and colleagues who are interested in this type of topic to just get more knowledge about be it hydrogen or be it other types of energy sources, but also the interaction between the different types of problems that we have, like conflict and climate or food, water, and energy. I think there is a lot of work to be done there.
Are you optimistic in the direction in which it's going? So, I mean, looking at what Jorge said, so number of articles have grown more than tenfold, from 23 to 300. But do you feel we're marching in the right direction, or we're not doing enough yet?
Well, what I see is that many doctoral students want to do something with climate change. So I think that is good. I'm a little bit afraid that grand societal challenges and SDGs take away a lot of our energy by focusing on these generic. So I mean, a topic like poverty in and of itself is also worth, thousands of dissertations really going deep. And I think we should spend more time on going into the specifics of these topics and not talk about them in general. I mean, I was one of the first talking about publishing on business responses to climate change or multinational responses to climate change. But of course, you should stop talking about business responses in general, because there are so many categorizations that you can make. And I mean, we should now that it's not just fighting the issues and lobbying against policies, but that a lot of companies are starting to do something. There we can even make a bigger contribution. And I think the more people we have who are interested in these types of topics and really helping to shed light on this, the better we can inform policy and practitioners in what they can do to make a contribution, if you want to see it from an optimistic side.
Wonderful, thank you. And Jorge, you've already started talking about this, but what are your thoughts on how we're moving forward?
Well, let's deal with the IPCC reports first, and then I'll talk a little more about the few opportunities for IB. Well, the IPCC reports are, not very optimistic. I mean, there's a couple of things. No, the IPCC reports are super hard to read. You have to, any of us who is in this conference has a PhD, no? We've been trained to read these kind of articles, but reading an IPCC report is something that takes weeks. And that's assuming you've been following them for 10 years. No, you go first dive into one of these, it's like harder than reading an organic chemistry article. No, so that's one big problem here. Despite all the negative messages in the IPCC report, you have to have the expertise of years to actually dig it out. Now, what most people do, of course, is just read the Wall Street Journal article about it, or the Economist article about it, or the New York Times article about it. No, but they paint a very dire situation. No, basically, you want to summarize the latest IPCC report. What it says is we had 10 years of the current emissions to surpass 1.5 Celsius. Now, what does that mean? No, because you told that to a general audience, even very educated audience, they say, well, so what 1.5 doesn't seem much. That means that what that means is exceeding that threshold means that a country like the country that Jason talked about in his book, I've been reading the book the last week, Bangladesh might be underwater for some, all the shore of Bangladesh might be underwater for a few months every year. That's what it means. Miami might be flooded when there is no hurricane. So that's what it means. No, so the report is actually very, it's a big downer. No, and maybe it's a reflection of our inability to do something at the global level. Now, on the more optimistic side, for the IB community, a couple of things. One thing is, Hans mentioned this. No, so one thing that makes me optimistic is listening to the students. The students really care about it. The enemy is us. I mean, us, our generation. We are the enemy. Our students are not like that. Even the most conservative students, I'm in Washington, D.C., I get students from all different political perspectives. Even the most conservative students get that, and they want action on that. So it's our generation. We are the enemy. But in the sense, the energy of the students, their interest, the fact that they don't understand why we still haven't done much about it, is something that makes me really optimistic. One of the key questions in IB strategy is, where do companies locate their subsidiaries? No, and my co-authors in the book, Chang Hung Oh and Jennifer Elsol and Vivian, my former student, they've been looking at this much longer than almost anybody else. No, and the increasing frequency of disasters, natural disasters, is really getting the attention of multinationals. Now, of course, multinationals still pay more attention to industrial disasters and terrorist attacks, despite the fact that natural disasters kill, for example, compared to terrorist attack, they kill, natural disasters kill per year per country about 100 times more people than terrorist attacks. So the bias still to pay attention to industrial disasters and terrorist attacks, but the increasing frequency of the disasters is really getting the attention of multinationals. When I mean disasters, I mean flooding, hurricane, cyclone, and drought, those type of disasters. And in the research that my colleagues have done that we talk about in the book, it shows that companies are shifting some of the location of where they put their subsidiaries based on the risk to natural disasters. This is in part driven by demands from insurance companies. Because insurance companies are the ones who pay when a facility from a big multinational gets destroyed by a flood. No? So that's a big incentive. No? So in that sense, I think from IB Scholar, there is a great opportunity here to start asking other questions. Well, how do companies learn? Which is another question we begin to touch on, but there is a great opportunities here. No, are companies learning? The multinationals that are suffered natural disasters, are they able to learn and transfer that knowledge to other multinationals that are operating in different parts of the world? So I think in that sense, there is opportunity. No?
There's optimism in the sense that there's a lot of us to do. There's a lot we can do by focusing on these issues. Jason.
Yes, I'll try to start at least with a little bit of optimism, I think, because I think that both what Jorge and Hans were talking about really gets to this great unknown, this core question of, does a collective incremental change allow us to make a paradigm shift? Because there are so many great initiatives that are coming out right now. There's new schools of sustainability opening up all over the world, efficiency, innovation gains in almost every sector. But is this really going to collectively change things? And that's something that I think it's very hard to say for sure if it's going to or not. Now, from the corporate perspective, I would say that this really wraps into the foundational principles of business society relations. whether you want to talk about it in terms of ESG or the SDGs, or you can pick whatever paradigm you like to work with. This can be great if the company actually treats it like a foundational challenge and not just the latest box ticking exercise. Now, there'll be a lot of talk, I know, the rest of the afternoon about CSR, and I'm sure that there will be examples of companies that can take that leap. But there are so many, as we all know, there's so many internal challenges to doing that I will just hope that the incremental change can collectively make a difference. Now, of course, some of us in the audience or around the world might be thinking, okay, yes, yeah, we're of course taking it serious. We're on the right side of this issue. And my question would be, are you really? Because doing even the most cutting edge ESG work, or adhering as best you can to several SDG principles, does not constitute enough to counteract bad policy and bad operational work, like running a company that sources dirty energy. Now, Jorge talked about this 10-year timeline. And unfortunately, when a lot of us here, we have 10 years to do something, we think, okay, well, we really have to start something 10 years from now, but we don't have to worry about it today or in this moment. Now, we're increasingly coming to a period where maybe net zero for companies isn't even good enough and they have to be net positive. Here's where I think Ansa's comment about sectors is so important, because it's comparing just company to company, net zero is very, very different, because I like to look at, for example, an extractive firm that has been able to make a lot of progress towards net zero is much, much more impressive than a company that doesn't have such extensive pressure to be net negative. And as Jorge mentioned, this is something because climate change is now. People think that we have time because perhaps this is a problem of poor, faraway developing countries, but it's such a short-sighted way to see this world's largest collective action problem. And from the corporate perspective, we all know that this is going to have a massive negative impact upon GDP, but we're all waiting for our competitors to take the first step or for governance to force us. Now, the big risk here is that companies might lose wide swaths of support if they just continue performative reporting that masquerades as action. This one of the encouraging things that I see as well, both in business classes that I teach, but also in development studies like classes that I teach with students that want to go into the private sector. These are the employees that are going to be holding companies' feet to the fire. It's not just employees, it's not just the public, it's investors, it's shareholders. They are looking for reactions, and they're looking for specifically action instead of words on a report. Now, what can we do as academics? It's a really, really good question, because as both Hans and Jorge mentioned, there's so many research gaps for us. But the challenge is when we come, especially to companies, I'm not sure about Hans and Jorge's experiences, but often, you can come to a company and you talk about these immediate needs for fundamental adaptation, fundamental mitigation. We can use the most sophisticated, convincing data. And in my case, it's on the business conflict relationship. But it too often comes back with that, like, oh, this isn't going to work for us. This is, too expensive. There are very big challenges in talking as academics with the private sector, especially from a peace and conflict political science side. So then the question becomes, what is the most effective thing for an academic to do? I mean, you have climate scientists who have been screaming into the void for 2 decades, and people hearing them but not acting upon them. So what they've started to do is you have Peter Kalmu, who chained himself to the offices of JP Morgan Chase last month. Swedish scholar Andreas Malm basically wrote the 21st century version of the anarchist cookbook for climate action. Now, I don't want to speak for Hans and Jorge here, but I personally will probably not chain myself to the door of Vale headquarters or anything like that anytime soon. But how can we thread that line where we can actually support the people who see how important this is and act in a desperate way, but use our research in order to help change corporate hearts and minds? I don't have an easy answer for that, and I really hope that this is something that us as scholars can take more seriously, because it's always a difficult place for us to blend research and activism. But if the climate change crisis is as severe as we say it is, then we may have to start taking steps in that direction.
Wonderful, thank you. So if I can briefly summarize this rather interrupted a series of comments, we are the enemy, but we can take that message and harvest the energy that it generates in young people, both to motivate young researchers and also thinking about people that work for organizations. Focus, rather than just speak generally about grand societal challenges. That resonates really very much with me. I don't know about you, I've read about 1,000 COVID commentaries, and a lot of them said, let's embrace the new future. It's all new, it's all happening, but very few people say things that are very specific. So sort of they're reflecting on what Ernst was saying, drill down, focus, work in deliberate ways. Act now, it's a gap. In research, we always talk about a gap. This is more than a gap. This is something that can swallow us unless we act. And that idea of perhaps engaging, I don't know, at everybody's personal level of comfort, the line between research and activism, but using our privileged positions to spread the message, both in our classrooms and through our research. If I have missed anything in your comments, perhaps chime in now before we move to the next question.
Yeah, I think, you haven't necessarily missed anything, but I think, there's a coalition. What I always see when I collaborate with companies or interact with policymakers is that there are a lot of us who are sort of like, who care about the issue and who can collaborate across the organizational boundaries that we're in. And that is not per se being an activist, but also business scholars coming up with good examples of how companies can collaborate, also with government officials, of course, depending on the location where you're in. But this is not, we're not in separate units. We can collaborate and interact, like we have speakers from policy and from companies. Same as you had the CEO of Ballard yesterday, and we'll have somebody from Vale soon. There are ways to interact and also to perhaps help accelerate the insights that we have. Because sometimes, you see policy change being driven by, companies who also want to take steps and want to take steps more quickly. And in this way, sometimes they can also collaborate with activists and all sorts of actors. So it's not that we're in silos here. So we can also make a contribution by just collaborating across these organizational boundaries.
And the last question we had thought about to discuss today had to do with geopolitical tension. War is on everybody's mind. As we have discussed and as our panelists have spoken about, these are extremely complex issues that no country or no organization can tackle alone. So what do you, and as you just talked about cooperation, right? So how does geopolitics affect what is going on, and what is your thinking about the future? How does geopolitics enter that conversation on climate change and energy transition?
Yeah, there's no way to talk. I deliberately try to avoid the word, but energy security. The Ballard speaker said that yesterday about this. Energy security was always going hand in hand with climate change, and with the energy transition. So that means that geopolitics is always there. So, and it's baked in this whole debate about, of course, depending on what your notion of geopolitics is. So if it's, the traditional state against state type of approach, which is a more traditional approach to geopolitics, it was already baked in this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where we had different types of countries, so developed and developing countries with their own different interests and with, sovereignty, words that were explicitly mentioned in these conventions, and has been, very explicit in all these United Nations conferences and conference of the parties, that all these, how many do we have? So geopolitics has always been here in this debate. not necessarily being the elephant in the room, but it's more that IB scholars are not so used to talking about it. While international relations scholars are. So for me, that was always, it's a very clear thing about energy security, first energy security of, now we're talking about this again, like geopolitics. And so from the European perspective, this whole new Green Deal that was adopted, which was designed to come with an energy transition, the sooner the better. Now it's being pervaded by concerns about oil and gas being available, being used, the whole balance between emissions and all that, and dependence on energy sources. So it's geopolitics all over, and but we shouldn't forget that in addition to the sort of like traditional state-to-state or region-to-region geopolitical tensions and collaboration or lack of collaboration, and now even war, I think there is also geopolitical. Companies can also be seen as geopolitical actors, and cities also. If you look at climate change and the energy transition, there's a coalition of cities, and it has been there for a long time, taking action on climate change and on making a transition. If you want to get some optimism from that, you can also see cities trying to make a transition, provinces trying to make a transition, specific cross-border regions trying to make a transition with local industries and local communities. So, depending on your definition of geopolitics, if it's like high geopolitics, like traditional state-to-state, yes, well, it's all over the place. You really cannot avoid it studying this topic.
Thank you, Hans. Jorge.
If I take a traditional political science international perspective on this, I would say that part of the reason why the IPCC reports get more depressing every 5 years is because of the nature of the geopolitical games playing here. And when I mean games, I mean negotiation. So I grew up in a developing country. I was born in a developing country, but I live in the US. I'm a citizen of the US now. And I have to say the main reason why we have COP27, the conference of the Paris 27, and maybe there is going to be a COP50, is basically because the US doesn't want to lead. The United States is not willing to take the leadership that it needs to take as a superpower, as the most wealthy country, to lead the way in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. As long as the US doesn't lead, other countries like Brazil, Mexico, China are not going to engage in this. And they shouldn't. If I was the leader of any of these countries, I will never do it. Why should I engage in adopting more difficult energy generation technologies that are produced in the US and sacrifice access to cheap energy from oil when the US is not willing to sacrifice? So that's one part. The other part is that the geopolitical is directly linked to the local. Now, going back to what Hans was mentioned here. A few 10,000 voters in West Virginia determine whether the Senate can pass an infrastructure package that has real investments and regulations to phase out coal power generation in the US. So we cannot just be so focused on the macro geopolitical environment. We are realizing that whatever the US can do, for example, right now as we speak, was determined by an election in West Virginia, a very small state that most people never visited, a very poor one as it is. We have a Senator Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, who is the one standing on the way from the Democrats to being able to pass this bill. Now, that's not to single him out. If it wasn't him, it might be somebody else. Senator Kristen Sinema from Arizona. So the geopolitical is directly linked to the local. And when people outside the US think about the US, you usually think about the East and West Coast, but the actual geopolitical decisions made by the US and our failure to lead is linked to local politics in states that most people have never visited. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Jorge. Jason.
Yeah, it's as both Hans and Jorge have alluded to, it's really the biggest uncracked nut, isn't it? How do you get companies, or how do you get countries to agree to cooperate? It's been something that climate scholars have been trying to figure out an answer to for the last 30 years, ever since we had our one great success in the 1980s by solving the ozone hole. But we haven't had that success since, and it's so frustrating to see, because we know if we have collective political will, we can do amazing things. I often think back to the unbelievable amount of progress that was made in like the 1960s with the space race, where you had two totally different programs from totally different parts of the world that managed to really achieve the impossible. But we're still looking for that way that we can frame this as a race to the top on climate change, because as Jorge talked about a little bit, like no country is going to stick its neck out there for something that might look good on the next IPCC report, but puts the country at a comparative disadvantage. And that's something that I wish I had an answer for. A lot of people wish they had answers for, but it's just so difficult to find that way to incentivize a race to the top. So then, therefore, if governments won't pull their weight, is the private sector one that can do it? And that's also very challenging, because when I consult with companies to share these insights, especially from peace research and from the climate perspective, these are foundational lessons for ways in which companies can act differently, especially in vulnerable and fragile spaces. It's not every time that the advice is accepted, and I empathize, because at the end of the day, these sorts of policies, these sorts of decisions, they're very easy because we know which is the more sustainable path. But it's not simple, because you have so many different, you have so many different competing interests, especially within larger firms in particular. Now, that said, I have seen so many situations of firms failing in places they shouldn't, because they let others determine their geopolitical knowledge and political risk. And at the same time, I've seen a lot of firms succeed when everyone else failed around them, due to taking a different approach to geopolitics and to political crisis in particular. And a lot of this gets back to, first and foremost, looking at the local and understanding your role as a business in society itself. Now, of course, the climate crisis amplifies all of these trends. So maybe the best way forward is this sort of dual-pronged path, where you're both doing the adaptation and mitigation innovation measures that are so prioritized now, but also looking more fundamentally at how you can reshape your relationship between business and society. And it might be the case, as we've seen in many conflict areas, that successful businesses actually need to do both, not just one or the other.
Thank you very much, Jason. And all of you, of course, can speak to that at more length. And it's a great mix of speakers that leaves you both uneasy and inspired at the same time, because that's exactly how I feel at this moment. Uneasy, but also inspired. So now is the time to ask your question. And in terms of logistics, if I may ask that you move to the microphone so that our speakers can hear you.
I looked at my own investment portfolio, and suddenly my bank gave me the ESG ratings. And I know those companies I've invested in, for some of them for 10 years, right? Sort of part of my pension investment. And some of those were sort of counterintuitive, like companies that I know, that I thought are doing very well, are not doing well on these ESG indicators, and other companies were doing much better. And so part of that certainly has to do with information asymmetry. Whoever makes the ratings knows more about the companies than I do as a retail investor. But at the same time, I have the impression that they pay attention to some things that for me doesn't belong to ESG, or there's some things about governance, for example, is in the indicators, but what is good governance, we may have different opinions about. So I've sort of become very skeptical about ESG as a as a meaningful indicator of whether companies are really doing something good on issues of environmental or social concern. What's your view on that? I mean, the counter opinion would be, Hans was pointing to that. I'm just going to share an anecdote with it. I mean, I'm not teaching this topic, but I took a group of EMBAs to Copenhagen, okay? And we had lots of conversations, and those conversations were about best practices that they could see in Denmark and that were different than what we had in Canada, and that were not directly transferred. We had conversations about best practices and seeing things work, and that really stimulated them. I don't want to step too on the feet of my colleague who's teaching sustainability here, but it seemed to stimulate them beyond what they had learned in that class, which is more abstract. Okay, but so question, should we study best practices or should we study ESG indicators? Any views on that?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that I mean, it really depends on how the ESG indicators are measured. So, I mean, oftentimes it is about companies that are reporting best and that are that get good grades on the ESG indicators. So, and it's very difficult to measure, for example, in the field of climate change. So I've been publishing on the Carbon Disclosure Project from, let's say, the first year that it started. And it's very difficult to get good information from, for example, carbon disclosure. Also because companies look at one another, but often even within their subsidiaries, the data are not comparable. And then what you measure is actually something that they also haven't harmonized. It's very difficult to see what type of emissions we're talking about. Like you have scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3. And you have like, so what these ESG indicators, when it comes to climate change, what they often do is see what sort of commitments the companies made. So did they sign up to this particular agreement or whatever? So, and then it's just policies. It's just stated intentions and it's not measurement. So in that sense, best practice may be better. I mean, another way of looking at it is looking at the dilemmas that companies face. So for example, I mean, I saw that in the previous session, there was something on divestment. Now, pension funds are very, I mean, have a lot of difficulty with should we divest fossil fuels or not? And yeah, so that is really an issue, but it's really complex because you can also try to help change companies if you stay there. So, but if you divest, then perhaps this whole debate about sin stocks and it's a very complex it's a complex issue. So unless you're able to sort of help shed light more on dilemmas, otherwise you might better go to best practices. I would say, Klaus.
Yeah, I would say that we have a lot of experience in this in the past for more specific type of voluntary initiatives. No, so for a ESG related initiative to work well or to at least have a chance of working well, you have to have certain minimum necessary conditions. One is the data cannot be self-reported. If companies are self-reporting on what they do, a lot of them are not going to tell the truth or going to exaggerate the positive and overlook the negative. There has to be third-party certification that verifies based on a specific performance standard who are the best performers in a particular ESG initiative. Finally, you have to have sanctions for those who don't perform well against the specific performance-based standards that are third-party certified and not self-reported. No, so you have these conditions. An ESG-related initiative can have a chance of working better, but most of them don't have any of this. They are all self-reported. There is no third-party certification, and you get to claim that you're part of an ESG-related initiative by adopting an environmental or sustainability management system, but not based on a specific standard. So you need these conditions for the ESG initiatives to work well, no? And most of them don't have these conditions.
And I would just add to that, you know, as an exercise for getting especially large corporations to think about their role in society and how their actions influence society, I think ESG has been great. But for the S in ESG in particular, there's a certain element of subjectivity that makes it so hard to deliver anything approaching actual, you know, fundamental numbers that you can say one company is good or one company is bad. You know, something after the Ukraine conflict broke out, something that really typified the challenges of ESG was this movement to start talking about companies that gave weapons to the Ukrainians as a positive ESG measure. And you know, if giving weapons to the quote unquote good guys is a positive ESG thing, then everything is a positive ESG thing. So it's about this notion of when you start talking about issues like human rights and democracy, this makes it much more complicated than I would say even in environmental or governance indicators that at least can be measured in some way that is more or less agreed to. And you know, the difficulty of getting those numbers aside. One thing I really like though is that trip that you took to Denmark, because that more than anything else, it really expands the realm of the possible. So I was really encouraged to hear that, you know, sometimes people have to see something to be able to say, okay, yes, this can be done a different way. Let's think about how to do that. So I just wanted to add that was really encouraging. I was happy to hear about that.
Thank you for the question, Klaus, and thank you for answering that. Danny.
Hi. Hi to the three of you, and thanks a lot for having done this. I know I put you through a lot of hell organizing it, but I really appreciate it. Great job. As part of the conversation, suddenly it occurred to me, and after hanging out with Klaus for 2 days, I start to think on, you know, saying something outrageous. And it occurred to me that there was a lot of talk about IB scholars, as if IB scholars was actually a thing that had a solution to things. And what occurred to me after having also tried to read the IPCC report and failed miserably, as we all did, is that the notion of IB scholar is too narrow to solve these kinds of problems. And maybe the first thing we ought to do is figure out ways to broaden who we are, our understanding of who we are. And our own institutions are complicit in this. They separate finance from accounting, they separate business and society and ethics from strategy. They create these invisible boundaries within the school that creates divisional boundaries that make it very hard for us to attack these problems in a unified way. And so I am channeling Klaus and saying, let's end IB and put together a business school that actually solves problems in an integrated way that respects the complex dynamics of the problems. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Danny. You can tell that Danny was a dean and has put a lot of thought into that. And my question to Danny is, was that a question or was that a statement?
You can take it any way you want it.
But I mean, it would be lovely to hear your reflections, your brief reflections on what Danny just said, in whichever order you want to take that.
Yeah, I mean, I would just want to say something about this because I've also been reflecting on this a lot. I mean, so I started working at the University of Amsterdam, which is a comprehensive university. So we have everything from the natural to the social sciences to humanities to law and business and economics. And when I started to work here, it was economics, and econometrics. And we created the business school in this faculty of economics and econometrics. And of course, given that we built it from scratch, it was way more integrated, and sustainability was more baked in the different groups than it is in other places. So that helps. So people start to pay attention to this type of thing. But also being part of a comprehensive university helps. But I still think that there's value to have international business scholars as long as they can talk to other disciplines. Because I think, you know, people in the natural sciences or climate scientists or people in technology assessment or people in law or political science or geography and what have you, and chemistry, I mean, they don't naturally pay attention to companies, and companies are hugely important actors, and especially when it comes to these global issues. So global energy transition that we need, global climate change. I think we need collaboration. We also need insights from people who are familiar with not just local things or systems things, but also the actors, and not just the government actors or the societal actors like NGOs, but also business actors that can help operate in this realm. But of course, it depends on how your international business group looks like and what they're focused on. This is an area. I'm one of the incoming editors of GIPS in Rosalie's team. I think this is an issue that I would love to have like a really multidisciplinary perspectives on these types of issues. I think this is very important. But yeah, I'm not sure whether we need to get rid of our business schools to achieve this.
I can tell you anecdote from my colleagues in the sustainability management here at GW. GW again is a big university, and we have a big IB department too. But one of my econ colleagues in the Elliott School of International Affairs said here, the best use of the business school is to turn it into a parking lot. That'd be the most efficient use of the business school. But more seriously, one of the biggest obstacles is that we as a business school scholar punish interdisciplinary research or done by our assistant professors. No, our assistant professors, to get tenure in any top business school, however you define it, had to publish in certain number of journals. No, and these journals don't want to hear that. They want to hear about theory contributions. No, they don't want to publish articles that focus on immediate problems unless the problem has a theory contribution. So that puts a great roadblock into the multidisciplinary research that is needed to resolve this problem. So other people are doing it. No, it's not done in the business school. And as Jason mentioned, there's new sustainability schools. No, Stanford just, I don't know if you guys saw the article in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal on Friday. It says Stanford is starting a new sustainability school with a 1.6 billion with a B endowment. That's probably it's a bigger endowment than most of the business schools around the world. Maybe there's 4 or 5 that have a bigger endowment than that. No? So the action is happening somewhere else. No.
Thank you, Jorge. Jason, anything to add?
Jorge actually stole my point, so that's fantastic, and we can, I think, move on to the next question. Yeah, just this challenge of interdisciplinary and publishing in top journals is something that makes it really, really challenging to prioritize. It is great that some journals are starting to look into the importance of inter and multidisciplinary work, but until we can really get those sorts of journals that prioritize it to the level of where it's considered a top journal, it will be a challenge, and I hope it's one that we can overcome, because this crowd also, everyone you talk to, they always talk about the importance of this. So it's just a matter of operationalizing it as we can.
So hopefully we can channel our efforts not to turn business schools into parking lots, but in sort of in making this reality, this multidisciplinary research and the awards and publishing there. And our next question, please, Eric.
Hi, my name is Eric Adolovich. I'm the filler, apparently, in the Dean sandwich because Carolyn Egri is right behind me.
This is an inside joke. So Danny was a dean, Eric is a professor here, and next on the line we have somebody who is also a dean. So that's just translating the joke here.
So I'll try not to be too much fluff in the Dean sandwich. Regrettably, I don't know that much about the literature, but I'm very interested in the topic. And I'd like to thank Mila and the panelists for an excellent session and a thought-provoking session. I was thinking in terms of my own research and what I might do and how I might think about things. My field of studies are primarily strategy and organization theory. And I've done work primarily in the area of governance, and also touched on varieties of capitalism. So I'm wondering, if we were to imagine an appropriate governance system and an appropriate allocation of property rights to solve our climate change issues, as well as, do it in a way that is also promotes economic growth, what kind of incentive structure, what kind of ownership structure would you propose would be an ideal way of tackling the momentous challenges that we're facing?
Thank you, Eric.
Well, I can take a stab at it. We need a carbon market. Now, right now, greenhouse gas emissions are free. We can emit as many as we want as a company, and we don't have to pay the cost of it. Reducing carbon emissions, creating carbon offset, doesn't make sense. So we need, and that's why this geopolitics is important. Now, we need a carbon market where companies that create carbon offsets can actually make money by generating more and more carbon offset. That's the whole key basic dilemma in the UN COP conferences. No, countries cannot agree on how to do this, and who is going to pay for it. The other alternative, as economists will say, is to put a carbon tax, so that generating greenhouse gas emissions is more expensive. But any policy that has the word tax attached in the US is dead on arrival. No? So maybe a carbon market is an alternative.
Jorge, some very specific answers. Reflections from the other panelists?
So, building on what Jorge said, perhaps we're always externalizing the cost of climate change. Perhaps we can internalize these types of costs in companies, so that, there's more awareness of these types of things. And in terms of governance structures, I'm not sure whether we should also look not just at private companies, but also at companies, family-owned businesses, state-owned enterprises, and all sorts of mixed forms. Perhaps that can help make a difference. But of course, I'm very curious what Carolyn will come up. So,
just a quick follow-up, and it's related to what Hans just said. Are public corporations the wrong tool to promote economic growth and climate change? Do we need to go beyond the public corporation and look at things like family firms, private enterprises, joint ventures, public-private partnerships in order to accomplish the goals that we need to accomplish?
Thank you, Eric. Any reaction to the follow-up question? I know we're close to time, but if you would indulge us with a few more minutes.
I think companies are actively engaging in sort of public-private and multi-stakeholder partnerships. I'm not sure whether they're always so keen on addressing the right issues, but perhaps collaboration between companies may also make a difference. There is some sort of the Ballard company's CEO talked about the Hydrogen Coalition. There are coalitions where these types of things may be realized. But of course, this is a great area for research, I guess, and especially in the Canadian context, where you can see there's so many fossil fuel companies, but there is also different types of smaller companies emerging. So perhaps large and small company collaborations. So I think there's a lot of research possible in your area, Eric.
Thank you, Hans. Carolyn?
Hi, Ans. Hi, Jorge. Good to see you and good to meet you, Jason. So maybe I'll just put my friends on the spot. So Ans and Jorge, you have painted. We have a number of junior IB scholars in the room and a number of doing work on CSR and sustainability. And so you've painted a pretty daunting picture in terms of the challenges. And Jorge, your data is really depressing. So on this, we know that's a reality thing, but what has kept you going all these years? And I know you've been in this game for a long time. So why are you doing this and what keeps you going despite all of these challenges?
Thanks for that fantastic question, and that might allow us to leave with some optimism.
Oh yeah, well, this is simply a super fascinating topic, and it's very important. So, you read it every day in the newspapers or whatever, on social media, wherever you look. It's such an important topic. And it's also interesting that you think that companies are not worried about this, but if you talk to individual managers, you spend you do a little elevator pitch, they ask you, what are you researching? You mention it, and they immediately say my family, my children, I do this, I do that. So, it's just an issue that is so important. And at the end of the day, you don't die if you don't publish in an IB journal. You can also start publishing. I published my things also somewhere else first, in other outlets, but I still found it very important. And at some point you will get there. Just keep on the good work. There's all sorts of way in which you can have an influence just through students, through media engagement, talking to people. So I think, it's simply a very important topic. Hope this answers your question.
I would say, besides what Anne said, there is a lot of people like you. There is a strong community of scholars in the Academy of Management or Strategy that are very supportive and help you keep going. When we started this, I remember as a doctoral student 25 years ago, there was very few of us. And most business schools never taught a class related to social responsibility, ever. This was something I studied in the School of Public Policy in the law school. If you look around now, this is a topic that is taught in almost every business school around the world. So despite some of the depressing numbers I mentioned, there is a great deal of progress, And publishing in those journals is always hard, no matter what area you're working on. So, what I found is, besides the support of all the friends I have all over the world, people like you, is that you can only do well if you are passionate and love something. And this is the topics I love. And then you read new things. I was just reading Jason's book last week, Vortex. It's a page turner, and it's like, wow. I wish I could write like that. This is not an academic type of dry reading, but it has all kinds of information. So all these things keep me going.
And I'll be sure to send you the gift certificate for the plug that you just made for the book, Jorge. Thank you for that. I'll just add very, very quickly, coming as a little bit more of an outsider perspective, I think that we can end on this note of optimism that, how things have changed in the last decade, especially in the IB community, about the role of CSR in particular. This is a sea change. Jorge has alluded to it, but it's gone from, especially when I talk with companies, this notion of why should we even put this in a discussion on the operations side at all, to one in which absolutely we need to put this in. It is essential to our core business, but we're just not sure how to do it in the right way. That core difference in how they see social responsibility and the role of business as a social actor is a tremendously important change that we shouldn't just dismiss, because it's so important to be able to have these conversations in a way that we could not 10 years ago. So I would say that, when you talk to your students, it's such an exciting time to be a young CSR scholar, because they know that when they go into a company or when they go into academia, they will be listened to in a way that they were not 10 to 20 years ago. So it is an exciting time, and there is cause for optimism, I would say.
Thank you, everyone. The enormity and the pressing relevance of these topics, seeing that things do change, passion and community will keep us going until next time we can meet and discuss that. Thank you so very much to our panelists for joining us today. We very much regret that you won't be able to join us for one-on-one conversations, but hopefully that conversation hasn't really ended. It's just one point on a long journey. So thank you, everyone, for joining us.